When the Isles turned silent Britain without Rome, the soldiers marched away, taking with them the last organized law, the last disciplined voice of authority. Their absence created a vacuum into which fear and uncertainty poured. In Londinium, the once bustling forum lay empty, the market silent except for the cawing of crows and the distant roar of wind across broken rooftops. Along Hadrian's Wall, the northern frontier now shivered with insecurity, the forts standing as monuments to vigilance no longer enforced. Without the legions, local leaders scrambled to assert control, often claiming the authority of Rome for themselves, while knowing deep down they were grasping at shadows. Roads, once arteries of trade and movement, decayed under rain and frost. Bridges weakened, aqueducts collapsed, and inscriptions marking miles became cryptic reminders of a disciplined past. Britain had been left with the memory of structure, but no structure itself, an island haunted by its own history. In the countryside, the rhythm of life altered almost imperceptibly. Fields that had once produced grain to feed Roman garrisons now returned to the wild. Villages that had depended on Roman engineering aqueducts, granaries, and roads struggled to maintain themselves. Peasants worked the land, but without the protection of the legionaries, the threat of raiders and wild animals hung over every harvest. Forests crept back toward the settlements, swallowing villas and roads alike, and rivers, once carefully channeled for transport, returned to their natural courses, flooding the land unpredictably. Markets no longer bustled with imported goods. Instead, local craftsmen relied on the skill of their hands and the resilience of their neighbors. Britain, once the northwestern jewel of Rome, was slowly becoming its own place again, ancient, untamed, and dangerous, a land rediscovering its pulse without the guiding hand of empire. Yet even in absence, Rome's imprint lingered. Latin inscriptions on crumbling stones spoke of governors, consuls, and benefactors long gone. Temples still held the remnants of the gods, their altars covered in dust, silent witnesses to a fading faith. The road network, still faintly visible through the forests, reminded travelers of the immense effort Rome had invested in linking the island to a wider world. Children ran through the ruins, unaware of the empire that had created them, yet in their play echoed the shadow of Roman order, walls, straight paths, and the illusion of permanence. The mosaics and frescoes, though cracked and faded, still told stories of gods, heroes, and distant land. In these remnants, hope and nostalgia intertwined, a longing for the security of a distant empire, and the first flickers of self-determination. In this silence, small kingdoms began to emerge, each carving out its claim in the shadow of Rome's absence. Hill forts and promontory enclosures were refortified, not with disciplined legionaries, but with local men armed with axes, spears, and sheer determination. These petty kings and chieftains inherited the authority of Rome only in name. In reality, their power was fragile, contingent on alliances, marriage, and the loyalty of those who tilled the land. Some ruled with a sense of justice and vision, while others ruled with cruelty, their reputations etched in tales of slaughter and cunning. Communities that had once looked to distant governors now relied on the charisma and strength of local leaders, whose decisions could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The landscape itself became a character in their story, rivers, forests, and hills, shaping battles, alliances, and betrayals with every shifting season. And as kingdoms formed and dissolved, Britain became a patchwork of independent realms, each fragile, each fiercely protective of its people, yet all sharing the burden of isolation in a land once tethered to the vast machinery of empire. Amid this fragile order, fear and superstition grew as naturally as weeds along abandoned roads. Stories circulated of spirits guarding Roman ruins, of omens in the flight of birds, of curses whispered into the soil by the dying and the desperate. Old gods, long sidelined by imperial worship, crept back into consciousness. Fierce deities of war, earth spirits of harvest, and the unseen spirits of rivers and woods. Priests, druids, and wise women wielded influence once held by magistrates and governors, offering counsel, blessings, and curses alike. Knowledge itself became currency. Who could read a forgotten inscription, predict the coming storm, or heal a sick child? In these shadows of power, morality was fluid, and survival demanded both cunning and courage. Every decision, whether to sow a field, defend a village, or strike an enemy, carried the weight of life and death, and the consequences rippled across the fragile social fabric. Yet, Amid isolation and fear, there were sparks of beauty and continuity. Children laughed beside streams that had always run. Women and men sang songs blending Celtic melody with the faint echo of Roman hymns, and craftsmen produced tools, jewelry, and simple frescoes echoing the artistry of an age that had passed. Britain, though fractured and vulnerable, was quietly knitting a new identity. From the ashes of abandoned villas and silent forums, a resilient society was emerging, one that would endure not because of empires, but because of its people. And in these quiet, shadowed corners of the countryside, the island was learning a lesson it would never forget. That survival demanded memory, imagination, and the courage to shape a future in the absence of rulers who once seemed eternal. The land itself had become a teacher, harsh but patient, and every season, every harvest, and every whispered story etched the foundation of a Britain yet to come. The horizon over the North Sea was restless, as if the waters themselves knew the destiny of the island they caressed. Ships, narrow and angular, cut through gray waves, their sails dark against the pale light of dawn, carrying men whose faces were strangers and whose intentions were uncertain. Saxons, Angles, and Jutes had crossed these waters for generations, but now their arrivals were deliberate, numerous, and relentless. They came seeking land, wealth, and opportunity, spilling onto the beaches of Britain with swords in hand and the confidence of people who had survived storms, winters, and centuries of hardship at home. For the Britons watching from cliffs or riverbanks, these newcomers were terrifying yet inexorably inevitable, like the tide itself, unstoppable and reshaping everything it touched. The sounds of oars and shouted commands became omens, heralds of change that would touch every valley, village, and forest. The newcomers did not merely raid, they settled, claiming abandoned Roman farms and long-deserted villages, transforming the landscape with their presence. They cleared forests, plowed fields, and raised longhouses, embedding their customs, laws, and beliefs into every corner of the island they occupied. For native Britons, the intrusion was disorienting, violent, and destabilizing. Families fled inland, seeking refuge in hills and forests, while those who stayed adapted, negotiated, or resisted. The cultural collision was profound. Roman roads and stone walls met Saxon timber and earthworks. Celtic myths merged with new gods, rituals, and a worldview shaped by the sea and forest. In this crucible, Britain was no longer merely a land of survival. It became a theater where cultures clashed, merged, and slowly reshaped one another. Amid the turmoil, culture evolved and mingled in remarkable ways. Craftsmanship adapted to new realities. Saxon smiths forged weapons and tools using techniques learned from both Roman and local traditions. Pottery fused Celtic and Germanic designs. Clothing blended practicality and inherited styles. Oral traditions flourished as memory became the only reliable record, with bards preserving tales of vanished villas, legendary heroes, and the perils of the sea. Children grew up learning both the language of the newcomers and the old Brittonic speech, their minds absorbing stories of gods, spirits, and heroic deeds. Britain was becoming a living experiment in cultural resilience, a space where survival necessitated not only physical strength, but creativity, diplomacy, and the courage to adapt. From the misted hills of the Midlands to the rugged coasts of the West, the fractured kingdoms of Britain rose like embers from a dying fire. Stone forts, once Roman, were repurposed into seats of power, their ramparts echoing with the footsteps of kings and warriors rather than legionaries. Smoke curled from hearths where councils gathered, and the air vibrated with the tension of ambition, betrayal, and negotiation. Every settlement had become a stage where survival and legend intertwined, a place where a single sword, a sharp word, or the clever manipulation of alliances could alter the fate of thousands. Here, rulers were not born. They were forged in the furnace of necessity, and their thrones were as precarious as the clouds drifting over the hills. Even the land seemed complicit, shaping battles, concealing movements, and offering both opportunity and peril. Kings carved dominions from earth and fear. Some ruled through diplomacy, forging bonds of marriage, tribute, and oaths that tethered distant communities to their will. Others ruled through terror. Their names whispered across villages and forests with dread. The terrain dictated strategy. Rivers became natural boundaries, forests hid raiders, and crumbling Roman walls served as fortification and warning. The authority of a king depended as much on reputation as on sword or levy. Men who had once labored as farmers, smiths, or fishermen could, in a single day, become warriors or advisors, their fates entwined with the ambitions of those seated upon these impermanent thrones. Every choice, whether to raid, negotiate, or fortify, rippled through the fragile tapestry of kingdoms. Survival demanded cunning, foresight, and the ability to read both people and land like an open map. War and diplomacy existed side by side, an intricate dance that could tip into bloodshed with the slightest misstep. Alliances shifted like shadows at dusk, and battles were fought not merely for land, but for reputation, loyalty, and survival. Siege engines were rudimentary, sharpened stakes. Fire and sheer human will yet strategy mattered as much as muscle. Raiders and kings alike learned to exploit terrain. Forests hid movements, rivers constrained attacks, and hills became natural vantage points. Victory was fleeting. The next winter, the next raid could overturn all triumph. In this crucible, leaders learned the art of memory, observation, and calculation, ensuring that even in defeat, the lessons endured. Each battle, whether won or lost, became a story, preserved in song, oral tradition, and the scars etched upon the land itself. Amid the turbulence, culture flourished in unexpected ways. Bards and poets recorded deeds in song and story, preserving both triumph and tragedy, ensuring memory survived even as kingdoms fell. Sacred sites once abandoned by Romans became centers of worship again, blending Celtic rites with customs brought by newcomers, producing rituals that were both ancient and evolving. Craftsmanship thrived, whether in the smithy, the potter's wheel, or the weaver's loom, creating objects that were practical yet artistic, reflecting a society rebuilding itself from fragments. In the smoke-filled halls of chieftains, plans for war intertwined with feasts and ceremonies, reinforcing both authority and cultural cohesion. Power was performed as much as it was enforced, a ritual of dominance, survival, and identity, where legend and reality blurred. And through it all, the land bore witness. Hills, rivers, forests, and abandoned Roman walls carried echoes of every clash. Covenant, feast, and funeral. Britain, fractured and scarred, was being forged anew, its identity emerging not from Rome's shadow, but from the ambitions, courage, and creativity of its people. Thrones of smoke and stone were temporary, yet they marked the rise of a civilization that would endure centuries of strife and transformation. Britain learned a profound lesson. Power is fleeting, but legacy etched in stone, song, and soil persists through generations. From these turbulent years, a new island emerged, raw, resilient, and alive with a pulse that neither invader nor disaster could fully silence. Every kingdom, every decision, every whispered legend became part of a Britain learning to survive and endure on its own terms. The sun sank low over the hills, casting long shadows across ruined forts, abandoned villas, and overgrown roads that had once been arteries of empire. Britain had endured centuries of upheaval, the departure of legions, the incursions of Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, and the rise and fall of countless petty kings, and yet it persisted. The land itself seemed to remember, carrying the stories of the fallen, the whispers of old gods, and the faint echoes of Roman roads beneath the green carpet of moss and wildflowers. In quiet glades, along winding rivers, and within the skeletal remains of former settlements, the remnants of empire and the seeds of new kingdoms coexisted in uneasy harmony. This was a Britain transformed, not by conquest alone, but by survival, adaptation, and the unrelenting passage of time, a land in which every stone held memory and every breeze carried the past into the present. Villages now spoke in tongues, mingled with Old Brittonic and the speech of newcomers, a linguistic fusion that reflected centuries of upheaval and adaptation. Longhouses and timber halls replaced stone villas, yet traces of mosaics, aqueducts, and Roman roads endured, hidden beneath thatch, smoke, and ivy. Fields tilled for centuries carried both the memory of Roman engineering and the ingenuity of Saxon plows. Britain had become a palimpsest, each layer of history written over but never fully erased. Forests and rivers whispered secrets older than any king or kingdom. Sacred groves and springs, long abandoned, returned as centers of reverence, blending old Celtic rites with the beliefs of new settlers. The old gods lingered in quiet ways in the rustling of leaves, the flight of birds, and the shimmer of moonlight on still waters, sharing space with new faiths and practices. This Britain was neither entirely ancient nor entirely new. It was a fusion, a bridge between what had been and what was yet to come. Trade persisted, though in quieter, more localized forms. Rivers carried pottery, salt, iron, and woven goods between villages and small towns. Craftsmen adapted Roman techniques to new materials and designs, producing functional objects that bore aesthetic and symbolic meaning. Oral histories became the lifeblood of memory, with bards and storytellers preserving tales of vanished villas, legendary heroes, and the perils of the sea. Songs and sagas held knowledge that written records could no longer secure. Instructions for navigation, farming, or survival embedded within allegory and myth. Britain's identity was no longer dictated by empires or rulers from afar. It emerged organically from the land, its people, and the stories they told one another by firelight. Each tale, each memory became a thread in the cultural tapestry of an island finding itself anew. In the quiet corners of the island, shadows held lessons for those who remained. Children learned to navigate forests, read the signs of the weather, and respect both land and transient human authority. Communities that had once clung desperately to Roman order discovered the value of autonomy, learning that governance was a craft born from negotiation, courage, and communal effort. Monuments of the past, walls, roads, and temples became both tools of survival and markers of heritage. Britain learned patience, endurance, and the subtle art of waiting, understanding that the greatest strength of an island lay not in armies or governors, but in the resilience of its people and the enduring rhythms of its land. Every harvest, every song, every repaired wall was a testament to survival against the odds. And as the first stars of evening pierced the darkening sky, the whispers of a forgotten Britain carried on the wind. Rome was gone. The legacies of invasions and petty wars had left scars, yet from the chaos arose a spirit that would define the island for centuries. Rivers, forests, and hills held memory. Songs and stories carried knowledge, and the people, ever resilient, ensured that the pulse of life endured. In every stone, every river, every story told beside the hearth, Britain's past was alive, quietly shaping the present and the future. Because the past is never truly gone, it's waiting to be reborn. From the silence of empty roads to the laughter of children in the forests, Britain's spirit endured, poised to write new legends on the canvas of time.